Imagine waking up in a world where the sun hasn't risen in 19 days. Where the air freezes your breath into crystals, and the silence outside your cabin sounds like the world itself has died. In the winter of 1880, thousands of American families faced exactly that, and most of their stories were never told. The sky that shouldn't exist. The sun should have risen by now. That was the thought that froze Mary Harper in place as she stepped onto the creaking wooden porch of their Dakota Territory homestead. The horizon was a strange, bruised red, too wide, too bright, too silent. It looked less like sunrise and more like the sky itself was wounded. The roosters didn't crow. The cattle didn't stir. Even the wind seemed to be waiting for something. It was October 15, 1880, a day the settlers would remember long after their hair turned white and their hands trembled when telling the story. Mary pulled her shawl tighter. She had seen many winters in the plains, but nothing like this eerie stillness, this heavy, metallic cold that smelled like snow long before the first flake touched the ground. Inside the cabin, her husband Thomas was sharpening the axe. Normally the scraping sound of metal on stone was comforting, but today it sounded urgent, nervous. "You see it too," Mary whispered. Thomas nodded once, without looking up. "It ain't right," he said. "Sky looks sick." In the distance, their neighbors were stepping out of their cabins, every face turned toward the same unnatural horizon. The Dakota sky was famous for its colors, pink dawns, gold sunsets, but this was different. Even the older settlers, the ones who had crossed entire states to build their homes here, exchanged uneasy glances. Then came the first sign. A flock of blackbirds erupted from the tree line like an explosion. Thousands of them, too early for migration, too frantic to be moving by instinct. They spiraled in tight, panicked circles before shooting south in one screaming wave. "Storm's coming," Thomas said. But Mary shook her head. "This ain't a storm." Something scared them. And she was right. Because at that same moment, 20 miles away along the frozen riverbank, an old Lakota elder named Mado Wiaka watched the same sky with sorrow in his bones. The white settlers called him Eagle Feather, because they couldn't pronounce his real name. He had lived through winters so cold they froze the sap inside trees until they burst like gunshots. He had seen storms that wiped entire camps from the earth. But he had never, in his 72 years, seen the sky glow red in the morning. He whispered in Lakota, "The winter will try to kill them." A warning ignored. That afternoon, the temperature dropped faster than anyone had seen. Children playing outside came running home with red faces and burning lungs. By sunset, the sloughs had a skin of ice. By night, the wells froze at the edges. The telegraph operator in town tried sending a message to Fort Pierre, but the line crackled with static. Something was interfering with the signal. Thomas drove their wagon into town to pick up extra hay and flour. Mary begged him not to go. "The horses are restless. They don't want to travel, Tom." "I'll be quick," he promised, without meeting her eyes. But by the time he reached the general store, the whole town was in a panic. Men whispered in corners, women clutched their children. A railway worker leaned across the counter and said quietly, "Tracks are icing early. Trains might stop within the week." "When was the last time that happened in October?" Thomas asked. "Never." And then the worker added something even stranger. "The last train from the east brought news. A cold front is sweeping the whole country. Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, all freezing early. This wasn't local. This was national. The night the wind turned. That night, the wind changed direction. It came from the northwest, carrying a howl that made windows rattle and lantern flames tremble. Mary woke up to the sound of something hitting the roof, hard. Not hail. Not branches. Frozen pellets of ice. In October. Thomas threw on his coat and stepped outside. The wind nearly pushed him off the porch. Snowflakes, sharp, needle-like, slashed across the yard. They weren't white and fluffy. They were shards. He grabbed a handful and stared. Ice crystals. The kind that only formed in deep midwinter. Mary came behind him, gasping. "God help us," she whispered. Because the plains weren't just experiencing early snowfall. They were experiencing an early deep winter. And far out in the darkness, beyond the fields and the tree-line, they heard a sound that did not belong in October. A frozen river cracking. Not a small crack, but a thunderous roar, as if the land itself were breaking. Thomas stepped backward, heart pounding. If it's this cold already, what happens by December? Mary didn't answer. Because everyone already felt it. The winter of 1880 was going to be unlike anything America had ever seen. The first death. The next morning, when Thomas went to check on the cattle, he found one of the younger steers lying frozen beside the fence. Its eyes were wide open, its body stiff, and the strange part. Its hooves were buried in ice. Ice that had formed overnight. Mary covered her mouth to hide a gasp. "Tom, a single night couldn't do this," she whispered. But it did. And it would get worse. Because this was only the first night of what history would later call the long winter of 1880 to 81. A winter so cold that the sun itself seemed to abandon America. A winter that would trap families, starve towns, freeze rivers, stop trains, and push thousands to the edge of madness. The Harpers didn't know it yet. But the sky that shouldn't exist was the first warning of the coldest nightmare the frontier would ever face. If you want, I will continue. The last warm day. At dawn the next morning, something unsettling happened. Warmth returned. Not real warmth, just a strange, deceptive softness in the air, the kind that made the frost on the window melt into streaks. The kind that made settlers step outside in shirt sleeves, relieved, and completely unaware they were walking into a trap. It was October 16, 1880. The last day anyone in the Dakota Territory would feel warmth for months. The calm before the storm. Mary Harper stood by the cabin door, watching fog lift off the ground like ghosts leaving the earth. The sky was clear again, the eerie red glow gone, as if the world wanted to pretend nothing unusual had happened. The animals seemed confused too. The horses pawed at the ground nervously but weren't shivering. The cows stood clustered near the barn, steaming in the sudden warmth. Even the chickens came out, blinking like half-awake children. Thomas stepped onto the porch, stretching his arms. "If yesterday was a taste of winter, today's our apology," he joked, trying to lighten the mood. But Mary didn't smile. The warmth felt wrong, like a sick patient briefly sitting up before collapsing. And she wasn't the only one who sensed it. At the far end of the property, old Mr. Garrett, who'd spent 35 winters on the plains, stood outside staring at the sky with a look of horror on his face. Mary, he said when she called to him. This ain't normal. Winds don't change that fast. Warmth don't come back like this. Mary swallowed. Do you think it's over? It's just beginning. A gathering in town. By midday, the Harpers were in town for the emergency meeting announced by the mayor. Nearly the entire settlement of Willow Creek had gathered, farmers, railroad men, merchants, mothers with bundled infants, and a handful of Lakota watching silently from the back. The mayor stepped onto a crate. He looked pale. We've received news from the east, he said. The storm system isn't local. It's countrywide. The railways are considering shutting down transport. Shouts erupted. Shutting down. Before winter even starts. What about our supplies? What about mail? What about medicine? A young man wearing a railroad badge shouted above the noise. The trains can't cut through ice on the tracks. The storm 2 nights ago nearly froze a locomotive solid. A woman cried out in disbelief. Old Eagle Feather, the Lakota elder, finally spoke. His voice was low, steady, heavy with meaning. The winter will not follow the old path, he said. It will come early. It will come hard. You must prepare. Some settlers scoffed. Others looked terrified. One man yelled, "Winter always comes. What's different this year?" Eagle Feather's eyes were full of sorrow. This time, the winter hungers. The room fell silent. The Harper children's discovery. Back at the homestead, while Thomas unloaded supplies and Mary restocked the pantry shelves, their children, Sarah, age 12, and little Jack, age 8, wandered toward the creek. What if the winter really is dangerous? Sarah asked. Jack shrugged. Maybe it'll snow so much school gets cancelled all winter. Sarah rolled her eyes. There is no school to cancel, dummy. When they reached the creek, they froze. The water wasn't flowing. Not sluggish. Not icy. Frozen. A thin sheet of glassy ice covered the entire top of the creek. But above the ice, sunlight shone warmly. The air wasn't cold enough to freeze water, yet somehow the water was frozen. Sarah knelt, touching the surface. It froze last night, she whispered. But why didn't it melt today? Jack asked. Sarah didn't answer. She didn't need to. They both felt the same thing. The cold beneath the warmth was winning. The strange visit. That evening, as the sun dipped low, someone knocked on the Harper cabin door. Thomas opened it to find Eagle Feather standing there, leaning on his wooden staff. The elder never visited homes. This alone was a message. Mary invited him inside, offering tea warmed on the stove. He drank silently, watching the flame flicker. Then he spoke. You saw the red sky yesterday, he said. Mary nodded. You felt the wrong warmth today. Thomas stiffened. You know what's coming, don't you? Eagle Feather set his cup down gently. The old ones in my tribe spoke of winters like this, once in a generation. Winters that do not follow the laws of nature. The kind that return and return, without mercy, without rest. Mary's hand tightened around her apron. How long will it last? Eagle Feather looked into the fire for a long time. Longer than you imagine. Thomas swallowed, forcing calm. What do we do? Gather food. Protect your children. Stay together. When the storm begins, do not leave your home. Not for anything. Mary's breath caught. Not even for help. Eagle feather met her eyes. The storm will swallow anyone who steps into it. Thomas exhaled shakily. And then Eagle feather added one more thing, something he had not shared at the meeting. Last night, the spirits warned. The warm day before a killing winter is a gift, and a trick. Use it well. Then he stood and left, walking into the fading light without another word. The last sunset. The Harpers worked until their hands ached, hauling wood, checking the roof, reinforcing windows, packing root vegetables into storage, and sealing cracks in the walls. Mary paused as the sun set fully. The sky glowed orange. The air felt mild. It could almost be mistaken for a peaceful October evening. Except for one thing. A single, thin snowflake drifted down. Sparkling. Beautiful. Alone. Then another. And another. And then the temperature dropped so suddenly Mary felt it like a punch in the chest. Winter was returning. Not slowly. Not gently. Like a predator. In the distance, wolves howled. The wind snarled. The sky darkened too fast. The warmth was gone. And everyone in the Dakota Plains would remember that day forever as the last warm day of 1880. The first blizzard. The storm did not arrive. It attacked. The moment darkness settled over the Dakota Plains, the wind rose in a violent, bone-chilling scream that tore across the land like a living creature hungry for destruction. Thomas Harper bolted upright in bed as the cabin walls shuddered. Mary, already awake, clutched the blanket tightly around her children. "Tom, what is that sound?" Thomas didn't answer. He pulled on his boots, grabbed his lantern, and stepped out the back door. The wind nearly ripped the door from his hands. Outside, the world was chaos. Snow wasn't falling, it was shooting sideways, sharp as shards of glass. The lantern flame thrashed violently before sputtering out, swallowed by the darkness. He could barely see the barn, only 20 yards away, but it appeared and vanished between furious swirls of white. It was the worst storm Thomas had ever seen. And it was only October. The world erupts in white. Inside the cabin, Mary pressed her ear against the wall. The sound wasn't just wind, it was like millions of icy needles scraping the wood at once. Jack whimpered, burying his face against her. "Is the house gonna fly away?" "No," Mary whispered, pulling him close. "No storm can lift this house." But even she wasn't sure. The Harper cabin was sturdy. Thomas had built it with thick cottonwood logs, but the storm hammered against it so violently it felt like the earth itself was shaking. A sudden boom echoed through the night. Sarah screamed. Mary leapt to her feet. The barn door had slammed open. Thomas came rushing back inside, snow crusting his hair and jacket. "I can't secure the animals. The snow's piling up too fast." "How fast?" Mary asked. "Half a foot in 10 minutes. They all stared at him. That was impossible. But tonight, impossibilities were happening by the minute. The ominous darkness. Hours passed. The blizzard only grew stronger. There were no breaks. No lulls. No moments of silence. Only the relentless roar of wind, so loud the harpers had to shout to hear one another. By midnight, the cabin shook with every gust. Thomas checked the windows over and over, stuffing rags into any crack he could find. Frost was forming on the inside glass. The temperature dropped so quickly that Jack's breath came out in puffs. Mary placed blankets over the children, then added more blankets, and then coats over the blankets. Even then, they shivered. "This can't be real," Sarah whispered. "It's too cold." Thomas turned from the window, his face grim. "It's dropping faster than during the January blizzard last year. I've never seen snow this early, or this strong." A violent gust rattled the roof, and a terrible creaking sound echoed through the cabin. The children froze. Mary met Thomas's eyes, fear tightening her throat. "That's the roof beam." He didn't answer. The night walker. Near 3 a.m., the wind shifted again, this time with a low, haunting moan that made the hair on Mary's arms stand up. It sounded like voices, distant, muffled, almost human. Sarah trembled. "Ma, do you hear that?" Mary hesitated before responding. "Yes. It sounds like someone's outside." She didn't answer that. Because she heard it too. A faint thump against the side of the cabin. Then another. And another. Thomas grabbed his rifle. "No blizzard would make sounds like that," he whispered. They all listened. Thump. Soft. Slow. Deliberate. "Something's brushing past the wall," Mary said. Thomas moved silently to the nearest window, wiping the frost with his sleeve to look outside. He saw nothing but swirling white. But then, a shadow moved. Huge. Slow. Four-legged. A wolf. Not the lean wolves they were used to, the kind that kept their distance from humans. This one was larger, hungrier, driven to the edge by the unnatural cold. It prowled past the cabin again, so close Thomas could hear its claws scratching against the wooden wall. He stepped back. "We don't open the door tonight. Not even a crack." A voice in the storm. Sometime before dawn, the storm reached its peak. The wind screamed with such force that Mary wondered if the sky itself was tearing. Jack and Sarah cried quietly, exhausted. Mary held them tightly. Thomas kept watch. But then, a sound froze him in place. A voice. Help. Barely audible. Muffled by the blizzard. But unmistakably human. "Help, somebody." Mary's face drained of color. "No," she breathed. "No, Tom. No." Thomas moved to the door. "Someone's out there." "Tom, you heard Eagle Feather." Mary pleaded. "The storm will swallow anyone who steps into it." Another cry cut through the roaring wind. "Please, help me." It sounded close. Too close. Thomas grabbed his coat. "I can't let someone die out there." Mary sprang up, blocking the door. "Tom, if you open that door, the wind will rip it off the hinges." "And then what?" "We'll all freeze." He hesitated. The voice screamed again. Agony. Terror. Sarah sobbed. "Daddy, don't go." Thomas's hand trembled on the door latch. For a long moment, no one breathed. Then, the voice stopped. Not faded. Not moved away. Stopped. Instantly. As if cut off. The storm held on. Thomas let go of the latch. Mary collapsed into a chair, shaking. Dawn's horror. Hours later, the wind began to slow. Just a little. Just enough to see the outlines of objects beyond the window. Thomas forced the door open against the snowdrifts and stepped outside. The cold bit into his skin instantly. But he continued. He needed to know. Mary followed behind him. They looked around the cabin, the barn, the yard, everywhere the voice might have come from. And then they saw it. Tracks. Human footprints. Leading toward their cabin. But they didn't continue. They didn't turn back. They simply stopped. In the middle of the yard. As if the person vanished into the air. No body. No blood. No sign of what happened. Just disappearance. Mary grabbed Thomas's arm. What could do that? Thomas stared at the storm-filled sky. I don't know. But both of them felt the same truth. The blizzard was not just weather. It was something worse. Something alive. Something watching. And it was only the first blizzard of the long winter. Trapped in the white silence. By morning, the world had turned into something unrecognizable. The Harper cabin, the barn, the fields, everything was buried beneath a mountain of snow. Not inches. Not feet. 8 feet. Overnight. In October. The front door opened only halfway before pressing into a solid wall of white. Thomas had to dig with his arms just to carve out a small exit. His breath curled in frozen clouds as he worked, every muscle in his body shaking from cold and exhaustion. Mary stood behind him, staring at the impossible landscape. It looks like the whole world disappeared, she whispered. Thomas nodded slowly. It's not a storm, he said. It's a burial. The new world. Outside, the silence was horrifying. Not peaceful. Not calm. A heavy, suffocating silence, as if sound itself had frozen. No birds. No wind. No animals. Even the sky seemed muted, a dull gray that pressed down on everything. Just enough to see the outlines of objects beyond the window. Thomas forced the door open against the snowdrifts and stepped outside. The cold bit into his skin instantly. But he continued. He needed to know. Mary followed behind him. They looked around the cabin, the barn, the yard, everywhere the voice might have come from. And then they saw it. Tracks. Human footprints. Leading toward their cabin. But they didn't continue. They didn't turn back. They simply stopped. In the middle of the yard. As if the person vanished into the air. No body. No blood. No sign of what happened. Just disappearance. Mary grabbed Thomas's arm. What could do that? Thomas stared at the storm-filled sky. I don't know. But both of them felt the same truth. The blizzard was not just weather. It was something worse. Something alive. Something watching. And it was only the first blizzard of the long winter. Trapped in the white silence. By morning, the world had turned into something unrecognizable. The Harper cabin, the barn, the fields, everything was buried beneath a mountain of snow. Not inches. Not feet. 8 feet. Overnight. In October. The front door opened only halfway before pressing into a solid wall of white. Thomas had to dig with his arms just to carve out a small exit. His breath curled in frozen clouds as he worked, every muscle in his body shaking from cold and exhaustion. Mary stood behind him, staring at the impossible landscape. "It looks like the whole world disappeared," she whispered. Thomas nodded slowly. "It's not a storm," he said. "It's a burial. The new world." Outside, the silence was horrifying. Not peaceful. Not calm. A heavy, suffocating silence, as if sound itself had frozen. No birds. No wind. No animals. Even the sky seemed muted, a dull gray that pressed down on everything. Thomas shoveled a small path to the barn. The children watched from the doorway, clutching each other tightly. Mary whispered, "Don't go too far." Thomas nodded, but already he felt an unease crawling down his spine. Something about this snow wasn't normal. It wasn't powdery. It wasn't soft. It was dense, heavy, almost wet, even though the air was far too cold for melting. It packed tight, like cement. He reached the barn door and saw the damage immediately. The roof had bowed inward. Snow pressed against the walls from every direction. It was a miracle the structure hadn't collapsed entirely. He forced the door open. Inside, the animals huddled together, eyes rolling in fear. 3 cows. 2 horses. 4 chickens. They were alive. For now. But the water trough was frozen solid, a thick, glassy block of ice. "We won't make it through the week if it stays like this," Thomas muttered. Because without trains, supplies, or passable roads, the settlers had only the food they had stored. And the Harpers didn't have enough. Not for a winter like this. A warning left in the snow. When Thomas stepped out of the barn, he froze. Literally. A chill so sharp it felt like a blade ran along the back of his neck. Mary saw his face go pale. "What is it?" she called. Thomas pointed. There, in the fresh snow just beside the barn, was a shape. Not quite a footprint. Not quite an animal track. Long. Deep. 3 claw marks at the front. A drag mark behind. "Wolf?" Mary whispered. "No wolf walks like that." "And the voice?" she asked quietly. Thomas didn't answer. Because the truth was circling him like a shadow. Whatever made those marks might be the same thing that took the person who cried for help. The town is gone. At noon, Thomas hitched one horse to the sled. "We need to check on town," he said. "If the mayor's still alive, we all need a plan." Mary grabbed his arm. "Tom, what if the storm comes back while you're gone?" He placed a hand on her cheek. "I'll be back before dusk." But Mary didn't release his arm. "What if the thing in the snow comes back?" He hesitated. Then looked her directly in the eyes. "I won't go far. If anything feels wrong, I come back immediately. Promise?" "Promise." With that, Thomas mounted the sled and took off toward Willow Creek. But he barely made it a mile before his heart dropped. The road was gone. Not buried, erased. Fences, markers, old wagon ruts, everything had vanished beneath a sea of white hills. It took him nearly an hour to find the old split oak that marked the halfway point. Another mile. Another hour. By the time he reached the outskirts of Willow Creek, he knew something was very wrong. The town wasn't quiet. It was silent. He tied the horse outside the general store and walked toward the main square. Every building was buried up to the windows. Doors were iced shut. Smoke no longer rose from chimneys. "Hello?" Thomas called. His voice bounced back at him, strangled by the cold. He stepped toward the telegraph office. The front door was frozen slightly open. Wind had blown snow into the room, covering the floor in thick layers. The telegraph machine sat on the desk, half buried, frozen solid. But the chair was on the floor. Knocked over. The telegraph operator had left in a hurry, or been taken. Thomas backed slowly out of the room. He moved toward the mayor's office. Snow had blown inside through a broken window. He scraped it away with his hands. Inside. The stove was cold. Papers lay everywhere. The desk drawers were open. Signs of panic. But no people. No bodies. No footprints. No signs of where they had gone. It was as if the town had simply vanished. The survivor. Thomas turned to leave when a faint sound reached him. A crack. A shuffle. A breath. Inside the livery stable. He approached carefully, rifle raised. "Hello?" he called. "Is someone there?" A moan answered. Thomas shoved the door open. Inside, buried in hay and shaking violently, was old Mr. Garrett. His beard was crusted with ice. His skin was blue. He was half conscious. Thomas knelt beside him. "Garrett. What happened? Where is everyone?" The old man's lips trembled. "They left," he whispered. "Left where?" Garrett's eyes rolled wildly. "The storm, it came back. It came, and they ran. They ran into it, thinking they saw lights." "Lights?" Thomas echoed. Garrett nodded, terrified. "Lights in the snow, moving, calling." Thomas's heart pounded. "What kind of lights?" Garrett's voice cracked as he whispered. "Voices made of light." Thomas felt his stomach turn cold. Garrett clutched his coat. "It's not a winter. It's something living inside the winter." Then the old man slumped forward. Not dead. But close. Thomas lifted him and dragged him to the sled. They needed to get home. Immediately. Because Willow Creek wasn't a town anymore. It was a warning. The sky darkens early. The ride back was brutal. Snow drifts rose like walls. The cold felt sharper, meaner. The sky darkened too early, as if dusk had lost its way. Halfway home, the wind began to rise again. Not strong. Just aware. Thomas heard something behind him. A crunch. A low growl. The faint scrape of claws against snow. He didn't look back. He couldn't. He shouted to the horse and pushed forward, heart pounding, while the sound behind him grew clearer. Crunch. Crunch. Drag. Crunch. The same pattern as the tracks by the barn. He reached the cabin just as the first flurries began to fall again. Mary rushed outside. "Tom! The storm!" "I know," he said breathlessly. "Help me get Garrett inside." As they pulled the old man into the cabin, Thomas turned one last time toward the snow-covered fields. Something moved out there. A shape. Tall. Slow. Watching. Then the wind howled, and the shape vanished. Thomas slammed the door shut. The storm returned with a scream. The night the sky went wrong. The storm had raged for so many weeks that the Simmons family had stopped trying to count the days. Time, in that long winter, felt like a frozen rope, something you couldn't measure, only endure. But on the night that the sky changed color, even hardened settlers who had lived through blizzards, famine, and prairie fires felt something new: fear. The strange blue light. It began just after midnight. Ella was the first to see it. She had woken up to check on little Matthew, who had developed a rattling cough from the cold drafts slipping through the cabin walls. As she leaned over him, something flickered across the frosted window, a blue shimmer, like moonlight but too bright, too sharp, too alive. At first she thought it was lightning. But lightning didn't pulse. Lightning didn't move horizontally across the sky like veins of fire. "Pa!" Ella whispered, shaking her father awake. "Something's out there." Jed Simmons rose, half asleep, but when he saw the glow through the window he grabbed his boots and his rifle in the same motion. Outside, the wind carried a high-pitched whistling sound, something different from the usual shriek of the storm. It almost sounded like the sky itself was humming. Jed stepped outside. The cold hit like a hammer. But the sight above him hit harder. The entire night sky was streaked with electric blue arcs, dancing like ghostly serpents. They twisted through the darkness, flickering and crackling. The prairie, buried in drifts as tall as fences, reflected the glow until everything, snow, sky, cabin, even Jed's breath, looked tinted blue. He had lived through storms, droughts, bank failures, and even a grasshopper plague. But this? This wasn't weather. This was something else. And then he heard it. A sound like a deep metallic hum, rising from the ground beneath his boots. The phenomenon the old folks had warned about. Jed wasn't a superstitious man, but every settler family carried folk stories like seeds from the old country. His grandmother had once told him about a winter so cold the sky cracked, with lights that moved like spirits and sounds that came from the earth instead of the heavens. Back then, he had laughed at her stories. Now he wasn't laughing. Jed rushed back inside, shutting the door against the howling cold. "That's no ordinary storm," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "It's the air itself, it's alive tonight. Fear in the walls." The family gathered around the window, watching the eerie glow. Even the youngest children stayed silent, sensing something unnatural. Sarah, Jed's wife, wrapped a shawl tighter around her shoulders. "What does it mean?" Jed didn't answer. He didn't know. But miles away, every family across the Dakota Territory and the upper Midwest was seeing the same thing. Pioneer diaries would later record the night as the blue storm or the electric sky. Scientists decades later would describe it as an extreme form of atmospheric electrical discharge, an effect triggered when a supercell blizzard collided with temperature differences so violent that the sky itself sparked. But in 1880, families didn't know science. They only knew fear. The night that changed everything. Then, it stopped. The blue arcs vanished in an instant, leaving the sky black again. No crack of thunder. No final flash. Just silence. A terrifying silence. And as the Simmons family watched through the window, the temperature dropped so fast the glass cracked in two long jagged lines. The fire in the stove flickered violently, struggling to stay alive. Jed slammed more wood inside, but the flames turned weak and blue. "Pa," Ella whispered. "Why is the fire doing that?" Jed swallowed. He'd only seen it once before, in a cold snap so brutal it killed travelers sitting upright in their saddles. "It means," he said quietly, "tonight's going to be colder than we've ever known." Outside, the wind died completely. Inside, the children huddled together. And the cabin walls, swollen with trapped frost, began to creak like an old ship lost at sea. That was the night the Simmons family realized the long winter wasn't just trying to freeze them. It was testing them. And the worst was still ahead. The storm that hunted people. The morning after the blue-lit sky, the Dakota prairie felt like a world that had stopped breathing. There was no wind. No sound. Not even the creak of distant trees. It was as if the entire landscape had frozen in the same instant, caught in place like a photograph trapped in ice. Inside the Simmons cabin, frost coated the walls so thick it looked like white fur. Jed had to pry the front door open with his shoulder because the frame had swollen with solid ice. When he stepped outside, he realized instantly. The cold wasn't normal anymore. It was predatory, aggressive, like something alive. The air that burned. Most winters bit the skin. This one stabbed. Every breath Jed took felt razor-sharp, like inhaling broken glass. The cold sliced through his coat, his wool shirt, even his thickest layers, reaching his bones within seconds. He only walked 10 steps from the cabin before the hair in his nostrils froze into tiny needles. He turned back immediately. Not because of the cold. Because of the sound. Faint, distant, wrong. A low, pulsing thud, like something huge was moving under the snow. Thump, thump, thump. Jed froze. The noise wasn't coming from above. It was coming from below. The drifts that swallowed whole houses. By midday, the air finally stirred. Not a gentle wind, but a bitter, swirling spiral that picked up loose snow and spun it into a white vortex. Sarah looked out through the ice-frosted window. The sky had turned the color of dirty pewter, heavy and sickly. The wind began shaping the drifts into tall ridges, walls, that rose higher and higher. Jed cursed under his breath. "That's not blowing snow," he said. "That's running snow." Running snow was a thing every old settler whispered about but almost none had seen. It didn't just drift, it moved on its own, traveling across the prairie like a slow, rolling wave. And today, it was moving directly toward their cabin. The first whisper of the snow serpent. By afternoon, the air was howling again. Snow whipped across the windows in thin, violent sheets. Little Matthew cried, covering his ears as the wind shrieked like a living creature. Ella noticed it first, a pattern in the storm, a strange rhythm in the gusts. "Pa," she whispered, "listen." Jed paused, his breath visible even indoors. There was something inside the wind. A low moaning sound. Not random. Not chaotic. almost, voiced. A sound many families across the Midwest would later describe in their journals as a serpent's hiss traveling inside the storm. Jed grabbed the door latch. Everything in him said not to open it. But he had to hear clearly. He cracked it open an inch. The storm roared in like a beast. And through that roar, Jed heard something that made his blood turn colder than the air. Footsteps. Slow. Heavy. Deliberate. Moving across the frozen ground. Except no human, no animal, nothing living could survive outside at that temperature. Whatever was making those sounds wasn't living in the normal way. He slammed the door shut. The blizzard that followed sent. Night came early, hours early. The storm grew louder, closer, almost purposeful. Sarah tried to calm the children, whispering prayers under her breath. But Jed was pacing. Something wasn't right. The storm wasn't just loud. It was circling the cabin. Wind hammered one wall. Then the next. Then the next. As if something enormous was walking around their home, dragging the storm with it. Ella's voice trembled. "Pa, does the storm know we're in here?" Jed stared at the door. He didn't answer. Because he wasn't sure. The moment it struck. As the night deepened, the storm suddenly went silent. Every sound vanished in an instant. No wind. No snow. No footsteps. Nothing. The silence was so total it made everyone stop breathing. Then. A blow. A single, massive wham against the side of the cabin. The walls shook. Snow fell from the rafters. The stove pipe rattled. Then another. Wham. Then a third. Something. Not wind, not snow. Was slamming into the cabin. Trying to break in. Little Matthew screamed. Sarah grabbed him and Ella, shielding them with her body. Jed grabbed his rifle, not because he thought he could fight a storm, but because fear makes a man reach for whatever strength he has. He pressed his back against the shaking wall, breath ragged. And the storm outside whispered again. This time sounding almost like a voice saying a single word. Open. The Simmons family clung to one another as the long winter revealed its darkest truth. This storm wasn't just cold. It was hunting. The ice house. The Simmons cabin had survived the first days of the blizzards, but supplies were running dangerously low. Their food stores were frozen solid, water sources buried under layers of ice, and the wind howled with a persistence that seemed to search for weaknesses in walls, roofs, and human resolve. Jed knew that staying put was no longer enough. They needed more food, more firewood, and a source of fresh water, even if it meant venturing out into the frozen wasteland. The plan to risk everything. Jed called the family together. "We can't wait for the storm to end," he said. "The snow won't stop on its own. The river's frozen solid. The town is buried. But there's the old ice house behind the mayor's place, maybe there's food left in there. Flour, salt, maybe even canned meat." Sarah gasped. "Pa, it's miles away. The wind, the cold." Jed nodded grimly. "I know. But it's better than freezing inside here with nothing to eat. We have to go." Ella clutched Matthew tightly. "And what about the storm?" Jed's voice was steady, but hard. "The storm isn't just snow. It's ice, wind, and night. But we go together. We leave the youngest inside. You two, Ella and Sarah, stay with your mother. I'll go first with a rope to mark the path. The journey begins. Jed dressed in every layer he had, wrapping wool over wool, furs over coats. He packed a small bag of essentials, knife, rope, matches, a small bread ration, and stepped outside. The wind slammed into him instantly, cold enough to burn lungs, face, and hands. Snow whirled around him in violent sheets. Visibility was near zero. He could barely see the outline of the barn, let alone the path to the ice house. Every step was a battle. Every breath a risk. Halfway through the first mile, he noticed the tracks. Not human tracks, but long, deep drag marks through the snow. Something had moved this way before him. Jed's heart raced, but he forced himself to move forward, following the trail toward the town. The ice house revealed. Hours later, though it felt like days, Jed arrived at the ice house. It was a squat stone building, built decades ago by early settlers to store food for the harshest winters. Normally, the walls were covered in frost. Today, the roof sagged under 20 feet of snow, and ice had formed over the doorway like a crystal curtain. Jed forced the door open with his shoulder. Ice cracked like gunfire. Inside, the temperature was warmer than outside, but only slightly. The shelves groaned under layers of frost. Flour blocks, salted meat, even some jars of preserved fruit, all encased in ice. Jed dropped to his knees, shattering a chunk of ice around a flour sack. He stuffed it in a canvas bag. One by one, he grabbed the canned meat, breaking the frozen crust with a rock. The trap in the ice. As Jed worked, he heard it, a low creaking sound, like the building itself was breathing. The ice house wasn't just frozen solid, it was alive. A sudden gust of wind slammed the door behind him, pinning him inside. The temperature dropped so fast he could see his breath freezing in midair. Then came the sound, a grinding, scraping sound, like fingernails across wood. Jed's heart stopped. He held his breath, listening. It wasn't outside. It was inside. A shadow moved across the icy walls. Long, thin. Twisting. Impossible to track. Jed grabbed his rifle, aimed blindly. "Show yourself," he shouted. The shadow vanished. But Jed knew one thing, the ice and snow weren't just obstacles. They were traps. And every blizzard, every drift, every frozen surface was a part of the winter itself, hunting, testing, waiting. The escape. Jed stuffed the last of the supplies into his bag. As he turned to leave, a crack split the air. The roof above him shuddered. A sheet of ice fell from the ceiling, narrowly missing him. He bolted out the door, pulling the rope behind him to mark the path. The storm had shifted while he was inside. The wind screamed in all directions, snow whipping into a white frenzy. Visibility dropped to near zero. Jed kept low, following the rope he had laid, praying the drifted snow hadn't buried it. At one point, he tripped and slid down a 6-foot drift, landing in a soft pile of snow. But when he reached for the rope, it was gone, buried under fresh layers of frozen white. Panic gripped him. He turned in circles. He couldn't see the ice house. He couldn't see the path home. The shadow of the storm seemed to twist around him, pressing closer, guiding him deeper into the white. Then he remembered Eagle Feather's words. When the storm begins, do not leave your home. Not for anything. Jed gritted his teeth and forced himself forward, following instinct, wind, and memory. Return to the cabin. Hours later, battered and numb, Jed reached the cabin. Sarah and Ella ran to meet him, dragging Matthew along in his small sled. Mary nearly fainted at the sight of the supplies. You made it. Jed collapsed against the door, shivering. Barely, he whispered. The storm, it's alive. It's watching. That night, the Simmons family ate their first real meal in days, bread baked from frozen flour, canned meat heated over the stove. But no warmth stayed. Every time they looked outside, the snow seemed to pulse like a living thing, as if it knew they had dared to take from it. Jed knew they were lucky. For now. But the long winter had only begun. The snow tunnels. By the 9th week of the long winter, the Simmons family had stopped thinking in terms of days and nights. The world had become an endless white prison, where time existed only in the rhythm of hunger, cold, and survival. Even inside the cabin, frost crept along the walls. Every breath of air carried ice needles that settled in their lungs, and the small stove they relied upon was nearly out of wood. Jed knew that staying in the cabin alone would not be enough. If they were to survive, they had to move through the snow even when the snow seemed alive. Discovering the tunnels. It was Sarah, the eldest daughter, who noticed the first sign. Look, she said, pointing toward the base of a drift behind the barn. The snow had been shaped by the wind into a strange hollow, forming a narrow tunnel leading into the deeper drifts. The mouth of the tunnel was jagged and shimmering with frost, almost like crystal. Jed frowned. That's impossible. Snow doesn't hold itself like that. Ella leaned closer. Maybe we can use it to move without getting buried. Jed considered. Survival was priority. The family gathered their coats and makeshift scarves to cover their faces, then began carefully crawling through the tunnel. It was tight. Snow pressed from all sides, freezing their clothing, numbing their hands. But the tunnel stretched far enough to take them halfway to the frozen river, a place where they could fish, if the ice was thin enough, or collect snow to melt for water. The danger inside. Halfway through the tunnels, something shifted. Jed froze. The walls of snow groaned, soft, wet, unnatural groans. A hiss traveled through the tunnel, echoing from every direction. Not wind. Not ice. Not snow settling. Something was moving inside the walls. The family crawled faster, but the hiss followed. A shadow slithered along the snow above them, and a sharp crack split the tunnel ceiling. Snow fell onto Sarah's back, pinning her slightly. Jed grabbed her hand and yanked her free. Move, he hissed. The family pressed forward, lungs burning in the freezing air. They emerged near the riverbank, where ice had formed into jagged sheets like broken glass. The river of ice. The river, once a source of water and fish, had transformed into a solid, glittering trap. The ice was thick, but strange patterns ran across it, lines and cracks that seemed deliberate, almost asterisk symbolic, like nature itself had drawn warnings in frozen ink. Jed placed his foot carefully. The ice groaned beneath him. Each step sounded like a warning drumbeat. Don't go too far, he whispered. We need water, but the ice, it's not normal. They filled containers with water from a small hole Jed managed to break, careful not to disturb the frozen patterns. Even as they worked, the wind began to shift again. A low hum traveled along the ice, vibrating up through Jed's boots. He looked down, and saw footprints in the snow that weren't there a moment ago. No human. No animal he recognized. They were large. Perfectly symmetrical. Dragging marks that disappeared into the tunnel entrance behind them. Jed froze. "They're following us," he whispered. "Escape back to the cabin." The return journey was worse. The tunnels were narrower now, collapsing in spots under the weight of new snow. Every gust outside pushed snow into the tunnel, threatening to trap them. Halfway back, Ella screamed. A sharp piece of ice had sliced her hand. Blood froze instantly in the cold. Jed wrapped her hand in cloth and pressed on, moving faster than he had ever moved in his life. When they finally emerged from the tunnel behind the barn, the family was exhausted, bleeding, and terrified. But alive. Mary pulled them inside, shaking her head. That was madness. Jed collapsed near the stove. "The snow, it's hunting us. The tunnels, the drifts, the storms, it's alive, and it's learning." Sarah sat next to him, shivering. "Learning what?" Jed didn't answer. He only stared at the snow outside, shimmering in the blue glow of dusk. The long winter wasn't just a season anymore. It was a predator, and the Simmons family had only just begun to understand its hunger. The frozen village. By the 12th week of the long winter, the Simmons family had exhausted nearly all their food stores. The snow tunnels had become their lifeline, allowing them to reach water and firewood, but Jed knew that staying isolated forever wasn't an option. They had to see if anyone else had survived, and if supplies remained elsewhere. With the storm temporarily abated, Jed made a plan. He would venture toward the neighboring village, 3 miles across the endless white plain, to see what had become of the town of Willow Creek. The journey across the plains. Jed, wrapped in furs and scarves, trudged through the snow that now reached over his waist in some drifts. Every step was a battle against the cold, but the silence was worse than the snow. No birds, no animals, no wind, just an oppressive, eerie stillness. Occasionally, he spotted strange tracks in the snow, long, claw-like impressions, some dragging across the frozen plains. He remembered the old journals and warnings, these weren't natural. Hours later, the village came into view. The ghost of Willow Creek. Jed stopped in his tracks. Willow Creek was unrecognizable. Buildings were half buried in snow, roofs collapsed under the weight. Chimneys were cracked, windows shattered, frosted over. Streets were invisible beneath towering drifts. It was frozen in time, like the snow had swallowed life itself. He called out. "Hello? Is anyone alive?" Only the echo of his voice returned. Cautiously, he made his way to the general store. The door hung off its hinges, snow spilling inside. The shelves were empty, except for a few frozen jars and a block of ice where flour once was. Jed's heart sank. And then he saw footprints. Not human. Not normal. Not consistent. They started at the center of town and led toward the outskirts, then vanished abruptly in the drifts. The signs of survival and loss. Jed moved through the village, checking the mayor's office, the blacksmith, and the schoolhouse. Each building told the same story, panic and abandonment. Papers scattered, frozen stiff. Doors and windows forced open. Signs of hurried escape, or worse, disappearance. At the schoolhouse, he found something that made his stomach turn, a group of children huddled in a corner, frozen in place, not alive, not fully dead, preserved in ice, their faces pale and frozen expressions of terror etched forever. Jed averted his eyes. This winter was not only deadly, it was unnatural. The warning from the townsfolk. Moving cautiously, Jed found a small outbuilding where someone had scratched a message into the frost on the wall. Do not trust the snow. It moves. It watches. It hunts. We were foolish. Below the message were footprints, deep, dragging claw marks leading into the forest line beyond the village. Jed felt a chill that wasn't from the air. The long winter wasn't just killing, it was teaching, guiding, and punishing. Anyone who left shelter risked becoming part of the snow's collection. The return home. Jed turned back toward the Simmons cabin with supplies scavenged from Willow Creek, some canned meat, salted pork, a small barrel of flour. But the walk back was more perilous than the trip out. The snow had shifted again, forming walls and ridges that obscured familiar landmarks. Footsteps he had left earlier were buried under new drifts. Strange, unfamiliar tracks appeared alongside him, moving in a way that suggested an intelligence behind the storm. Hours passed, and darkness fell. Even with his lantern, Jed could barely see the path. Shadows danced across the drifts, tall, twisting shapes that disappeared the moment he looked directly at them. When he finally reached the cabin, Mary and the children ran to meet him. Relief flooded their faces, but Jed could see the same fear mirrored in their eyes. The village, he said simply. It's gone. Not burned, not raided, just erased. Mary hugged him tightly. We're still here. That's what matters. Jed looked out the window into the white horizon. For now, he said quietly. The long winter had claimed the village. It had shown its power. But it had also marked the survivors. The Simmons family knew, deep in their bones, that the storm was not finished with them. Surviving the end. The Simmons family had endured 12 relentless weeks of cold, hunger, and terror. The long winter had tested them beyond any measure, turning the sky into a battlefield of light, transforming snow into a living predator, and erasing entire villages. Every day was a fight, every night a gamble with death. Now, as the final chapter of that brutal season unfolded, they faced the storm's ultimate trial. The final night approaches. The wind howled with a strange intelligence, circling the cabin, reshaping drifts into massive walls taller than the roof. The snow seemed to pulse, like it was breathing. Jed stood at the door, rifle ready, eyes scanning the white horizon, while Mary wrapped blankets tighter around the children. This is different, Jed muttered. It's angrier. Smarter. Ella shivered. Is this the end, Pa? Jed didn't answer. He didn't know. But deep in his heart, he felt the truth. The long winter wasn't just cold. It wasn't just a storm. It was hunting them specifically now, testing their courage, endurance, and will to survive. The ice serpent returns. At midnight, the snow shifted violently. Outside, massive shapes moved beneath the drifts, long, twisting shadows that pressed against the cabin walls. The snow serpent the settlers had whispered about, the creature of frost and ice, half imagination, half reality, was real. Its hiss cut through the air like a razor. The walls of the cabin shook as the first heavy blow struck. Windows rattled. The roof groaned. Even the thick logs seemed to bend under invisible weight. Matthew cried. Sarah and Ella clung to each other. Mary whispered prayers she hadn't remembered knowing. Jed gripped his rifle, but he knew there was no weapon for this. No bullets, no fire, no chains could stop a winter that was alive. The strategy of survival. Jed remembered Eagle Feather's warning, use the gift of warmth before a killing winter. Stay together. Do not leave your home. They had survived by adhering to that wisdom, conserving heat, rationing food, moving only when necessary, and relying on each other. Jed reinforced the stove with every scrap of wood. Mary blocked cracks with thick blankets. Together, they created an inner sanctuary, a pocket of warmth and light within the freezing chaos outside. They huddled together, holding hands, whispering quietly, their bodies radiating the only warmth left on the prairie. Outside, the storm thrashed. Inside, the family focused on each other. The long winter's fury peaks. The snow walls pressed against the cabin as if trying to crush it. Gusts blew the roof shingles skyward. Frost crept along the logs like a living creature. Shadows of the snow serpent danced across the windows. It was the apex of the long winter, the moment it wanted to claim the survivors. Jed whispered, "We survive by enduring. By refusing to move. By being in the storm but not of I." Hours passed. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Every breath was frozen. Every heartbeat echoed like a drum in the cabin. The storm roared louder, then. A strange calm fell. Dawn of survival. When the first faint light of dawn crept across the frozen horizon, the snow had stopped moving. The wind fell silent. The blue glow that had haunted nights earlier disappeared. Jed stepped outside cautiously. The world was still buried under snow, but the threat seemed to have passed. The footprints in the drifts, those dragging, claw-like marks, were gone. The tunnels, the walls, the ice, the snow serpent, had vanished, leaving only the endless, silent white prairie. The Simmons family emerged from the cabin together, blinking in the weak sun. Their clothes were frozen stiff, their hands red and numb. Their food stores were low, but they had survived. Jed looked across the empty plains and whispered, "We made it." Mary held the children tightly. "We're alive. That's what matters." The aftermath. In the weeks that followed, settlers began cautiously emerging from their homes. Villages like Willow Creek were mostly gone, either buried or abandoned. Survivors told of the blue-lit skies, moving snow, and creatures of frost that seemed to watch, follow, and hunt. Historians would later call it the long winter of 1880 to 1881, a season of unimaginable cold and destruction. Meteorologists described it as a unique combination of blizzards, extreme temperature drops, and ice storms. But for those who lived through it, like the Simmons family, it wasn't just a winter. It was alive. It had tested humanity, teaching one brutal lesson: in nature's fury, survival comes not from strength alone, but from unity, courage, and the stubborn will to endure. The legacy of the long winter. The Simmons family rebuilt slowly, telling stories of the winter that almost killed them. Children would grow up hearing about the snow serpent, the blue-lit skies, and the ice tunnels. And every year, when October winds began to howl and snow first fell, the survivors would whisper to each other. Remember 1880. Remember the winter that was alive. The long winter ended, but its legend endured forever.